It's this really strange paradox of the modern world. I was just thinking about this. We are living in arguably the most advanced period in human history.
Well, without a doubt.
Yeah, I mean, we have technology that previous generations couldn't even fathom. We have more information in our pockets than entire civilizations gathered in a lifetime.
Right.
We have speed, convenience, connectivity. And yet, if you ask almost anyone how they feel or, how they view the world right now, the answer is usually some variation of the exact same word, which is unstable.
Unstable. Yeah, it really is the defining contradiction of our time.
It is.
Because if we look at the raw data, we have better healthcare globally, but rising rates of chronic stress and autoimmune conditions.
Wow, yeah.
We have more communication tools than ever before, but sociological studies consistently report deeper, more pervasive loneliness.
It's like progress solved a multitude of these historical physical problems.
But quietly, almost invisibly, created a completely new set of structural crises.
Exactly. People are just exhausted. I mean, you see it everywhere. Institutions that stood for decades are suddenly distrusted. Workplaces are burning people out at record rates.
Yeah.
And we see these massive systemic collapses, whether it's a legacy corporation filing for bankruptcy or a political system polarizing to the point of total gridlock. Or even just a long-term marriage suddenly ending.
Right, and it always feels like it came completely out of nowhere.
Yes, we sit there and think, well, how did this happen so fast?
Or what if it didn't come out of nowhere at all?
Right. What if the chaos we are seeing isn't actually random? Okay, let's unpack this. Because today we are going on a deep dive into a truly paradigm-shifting framework.
I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. We are looking at Sandeep Chavan's 2026 book, The Game of Ours. And our mission for you today is to give you a radically new structural lens to decode this chaos.
A completely new way of seeing things.
Exactly. We want to uncover the hidden geometry of human behavior and systemic change so you can actually understand what is happening in your own life and, in the massive systems operating all around you.
And to build that structural lens, we have to start with the foundational premise of Chavan's work, which is drawn from a field called universal energy dynamics, or UED.
UED, right?
Yeah. And the core premise is quite simple, but it upends most of our assumptions. The premise is this. The world is not falling apart. It is constantly trying to reorganize itself.
Trying to reorganize itself, that's a very different way of looking at it.
It really is. When we see a breakdown, we are not looking at random, irrational chaos. We are looking at unresolved intelligence trying to find its way back to equilibrium.
Wow.
Every intelligent system, whether that is your own central nervous system, your family unit, your company, or an entire civilization, it is always seeking resolution.
That reframes the entire human experience. I mean, it changes the narrative from everything is broken and dying to everything is trying to adapt and survive. But to get to that perspective, to really understand how systems reorganize themselves, Chavan says we first have to completely unlearn how we currently view crises.
We have to shatter what he calls the illusion of the event.
Right, the illusion of the event. Let's define what that actually means in practice, because I think this is where a lot of us get stuck.
Well, the illusion of the event is one of the most pervasive cognitive traps in modern thinking. Human beings are, we're biologically and psychologically wired to notice dramatic changes in our environment.
Sure, it's a survival mechanism.
Exactly. We notice what is loud. We notice the sudden interruption of normalcy. So when a couple files for divorce, or a massive corporate giant collapses overnight, or a political protest erupts in the streets, our brains point to that visible disruption.
And we declare, there is the problem.
Right. We think that moment is when the problem started.
So the visible event becomes the entire story. The media focuses on the headline. The corporate board focuses on the sudden drop in quarterly earnings.
And we want someone to blame right in that specific moment of crisis.
We're obsessed with finding the villain. But Chavan argues that mistaking the visible disruption for the beginning of the problem is a fundamental error.
It's a huge error in how we perceive reality. In the architecture of systems, visible events are almost never the beginning.
They're the end, right?
Yes, they are the final stage of long, invisible processes. Systems rarely fail instantly. They collapse when small, unresolved consequences quietly accumulate.
Beyond a system's sustainable tolerance limit.
Exactly. It is the operating principle of gradually, then suddenly.
Gradually, then suddenly. Let's break down the mechanics of that, because this is where universal energy dynamics differs so radically from mainstream thinking, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Mainstream psychology, politics, leadership, they're all obsessed with consequences and blame. They ask, who caused this? Who is right? Whose fault is it?
But UED shifts the focus entirely away from individuals and onto structure and geometry.
So instead of hunting for a villain,
UED asks a structural question. What kind of imbalance is trying to resolve itself?
and Chavan represents this accumulated imbalance with the mathematical concept of delta, right?
Yes, delta. In physics and mathematics, delta represents change or difference.
Right, like the change in temperature or velocity.
Exactly. In the game of ours, delta represents the quantifiable gap between a system's current operating capacity and the external or internal demands being placed upon it.
Okay, so the gap between what you can handle and what's being asked of you.
Precisely. So the question becomes, what unresolved delta is driving this specific system toward a breaking point?
So we have to stop asking who is to blame and start asking what structural pressure is building up.
That's the shift.
Like, if you are looking at your own company right now and everything looks great on paper, but everyone is secretly exhausted, you are watching delta accumulate.
They're watching the gap widen.
Let's look at a massive historical example to see how this geometry plays out. Consider the collapse of Nokia's mobile phone dominance.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
On the surface, if you bought into the illusion of the event, you would say the iPhone launched in 2007, and that event killed Nokia.
Right. But if we apply the UED lens to Nokia, the timeline looks completely different. The delta didn't begin with Apple.
It didn't?
No. The delta began years earlier, around 2004. Nokia had a massive market share, so on paper, the metrics were flawless, revenue was growing.
Everyone thought they were invincible.
Exactly. But beneath the surface, the organizational structure was accumulating severe, unresolved imbalance. They had transitioned to a highly bureaucratic matrix management structure.
Ah, the classic corporate maze.
And they prioritized what Chavan calls performance over coherence.
Meaning they wanted the financial results, but they ignored the sustainability of how those results were being generated.
Right. They prioritized control and metrics over trust and innovation. This created a profound culture of fear inside the company.
Because everyone was just terrified of failing.
Middle managers were terrified of missing targets, so they began suppressing bad news. When the software engineers realized their operating system, Symbian, was becoming clunky and couldn't compete with the emerging touchscreen technology.
They couldn't push that information up the chain.
No, the executives only wanted to hear that everything was fine.
Wow. So the executives demanded a reality that didn't exist, and the employees provided the illusion of that reality while absorbing the stress of the actual reality.
Yes. The people inside the system were feeling the immense pressure of that cognitive dissonance.
But because corporate culture often glorifies relentless positivity, like just keep pushing forward, those warning signals were suppressed.
The system continued to function, and it functioned profitably for a time, but functioning became increasingly expensive on a structural level.
The delta was growing.
The gap between what Nokia was equipped to do and what the market was demanding was quietly expanding. And because the system refused to adapt to its internal reality, the collapse, when it finally manifested publicly, appeared sudden.
The illusion of the event.
Exactly. Structurally, it was the inevitable consequence of ignoring the buildup of pressure beyond a sustainable threshold.
But wait, let me challenge this framework for a second here.
Sure, go ahead.
I can see how delta applies to an organization with a toxic culture, but isn't some chaos truly random? Like, what about a sudden natural disaster? A massive tornado destroying a town isn't accumulated delta.
Right.
It is just external, unpredictable physical chaos. Does this framework just ignore physical externalities and force everything into this neat geometry?
That is a crucial distinction to make. UED does not claim that external shocks do not exist. The tornado is indeed an external random event.
Okay.
However, Chavan points out that while the tornado itself is random, the systemic collapse that follows it is entirely governed by delta.
How so? Walk me through that.
Well, consider two different towns hit by the exact same tornado. Town A has heavily invested in community trust, robust emergency infrastructure, and resilient building codes.
They're structurally sound.
Right. Town B has a history of political corruption, neglected infrastructure, and deep social division. The tornado hits both.
Same exact event.
Same event. In Town A, the community suffers damage but rapidly reorganizes. They share resources, they rebuild. In Town B, the tornado triggers a complete systemic collapse. Looting, starvation, and long-term abandonment.
Wow, okay. I see where you're going with this.
The tornado was the trigger, but the collapse of Town B was driven by the hidden delta, the pre-existing, unresolved structural rot. The trigger is random, but the vulnerability is geometric.
That fundamentally changes how we look at resilience. I mean, the system isn't responsible for the external shock, but it is entirely responsible for the accumulated structural weakness that allows the shock to destroy it.
Precisely.
And this applies perfectly to how UED views ideological conflicts and political polarization, which is probably the most chaotic system we interact with daily right now.
Oh, it's incredibly chaotic. And what's fascinating here is that in mainstream political discourse, the conversation is entirely absorbed by the illusion of the event and the culture of blame.
Yes, the question is always, who is morally right?
Exactly. One side fears systemic oppression, the other side fears systemic collapse. One side fears economic stagnation, the other fears cultural instability.
But under the UED lens, we step entirely outside of moral judgment, right? I want to make sure we're very clear on this for the listeners.
Yes, we have to. Ideological conflicts, the intense polarization between left-wing and right-wing ideologies, are not fundamentally viewed as a battle between good and evil in this framework.
That is a deeply uncomfortable shift for a lot of people to make. I mean, we are very attached to our moral narratives.
We are. It requires a high degree of objective detachment. But UED views these opposing ideologies simply as competing resolution strategies responding to a shared instability.
A shared instability.
Society as a whole is experiencing an enormous accumulation of unresolved delta. We are dealing with unprecedented technological disruption, shifting global economies, and changes in fundamental social structures.
The societal system itself is highly unstable.
And the human mind abhors prolonged ambiguity, so it seeks certainty. People adopt rigid ideological identities to find emotional and cognitive coherence in an unstable environment.
So under this framework, the political right and the political left are simply different groups proposing different architectural strategies to restore balance to a system that is under massive pressure.
Exactly. One strategy might prioritize historical continuity and hierarchy to stabilize the system, while the other might prioritize structural equalization and reform to stabilize it.
And UED doesn't endorse either side. It just observes the physics of the reaction. It impartially looks at how groups attempt to resolve pressure.
It merely observes that both are reacting to the exact same underlying structural tension. Both are attempting to resolve the delta. Once you grasp this, you stop judging the players and start observing the game.
Stop judging the players and start observing the game. I love that. But it brings up a huge question. If systems collapse gradually because we ignore this buildup of pressure, how does the system actually try to warn us before the collapse?
Right, because Chavan is very clear that systems want to survive. They don't want to shatter.
And this introduces the first major phase of the 5R framework restoration dynamics.
Yes. Restoration dynamics encompass the first two R's, resistance and rebellion.
Okay, resistance and rebellion.
The governing principle of this phase is that the system is attempting to fix itself without fundamentally changing its core structure.
So it's not a complete overhaul yet.
No, it still operates under the belief that the current architecture can work, provided it receives a minor course correction. Systems heavily prefer restoration because it is energy efficient.
Ah, that makes sense biologically and economically.
Preserving the existing continuity is mathematically and biologically much cheaper than tearing everything down and starting over.
Let's look at the first mechanism of that preservation, R1 resistance. Chavan calls this the first whisper of reality. I have to say, I found this to be one of the most profound paradigm shifts in the entire book.
It really challenges our cultural programming.
It really does. In our modern hustle culture, if you show resistance, you are immediately pathologized. You are labeled lazy, you are afraid of change, you lack a growth mindset, or, you aren't a team player. We view resistance as a glitch to be eradicated.
We spent enormous amounts of capital, both financial and emotional, trying to eliminate resistance, failing to realize that we are systematically dismantling our own early warning alarm systems.
Yeah.
UED radically reframes resistance. It is not a moral failing or a psychological weakness. Resistance is protective intelligence.
Protective intelligence.
It is friction communicating that a structural threshold is being approached.
Let's ground this in the biology of the human body, because I think that makes it very tangible.
Yeah.
When you decide to work 80-hour weeks for a month, your body doesn't just instantly die on day 30.
Yeah.
It starts sending early signals. You get brain fog, your joints ache. You develop a mild, persistent headache. That is resistance.
The biological system is whispering.
It is saying the current rate of output exceeds our sustainable metabolic capacity. Can we restore balance before deeper cellular damage occurs?
And the exact same mechanism operates in organizational sociology. Consider an employee who suddenly hesitates or passively resists taking on a major new project or a promotion.
Management's immediate diagnostic is often a lack of ambition or a bad attitude.
Exactly. But if we view the employee as a complex system, their internal architecture might be calculating the hidden costs of that promotion.
Like the loss of family time.
Or the increased cognitive load, the lack of adequate support staff. They are resisting because their system senses an incompatibility between the demand and their capacity.
Or think about a child who suddenly refuses to go to school. We assume they're just being difficult or truant.
Right, we punish the behavior.
But perhaps their nervous system is resisting an environment that feels emotionally unsafe or sensory overwhelming. Friction isn't reality failing. Friction is reality trying to communicate.
The system is quietly asking for a small, low-cost recalibration. Perhaps the employee just needs a flexible schedule. Perhaps the child needs a different learning accommodation.
These are cheap fixes that preserve the overall continuity of the system.
But because we are aggressively trained to push through friction, to silence the whisper, we almost universally miss the opportunity for these low-cost adjustments.
And what happens when a system's protective intelligence is continuously ignored? I mean, the delta doesn't magically vanish, it compounds.
It compounds.
Which brings us to R2 rebellion. When resistance is repeatedly ignored, silence becomes signal. The whistle turns into a shout.
This is a critical threshold in the game of ours. Resistance ignored becomes rebellion.
The system escalates.
Yes. The system recalculates its strategy. It realizes that quiet discomfort and subtle friction are failing to initiate a course correction, so it actively escalates the visibility of the pressure.
And Chavan writes that, contrary to popular belief, rebellion is not about destruction. He defines it as frustrated restoration.
Frustrated restoration. It is a deeply compassionate lens for understanding disruptive human behavior.
It really is.
When we witness a teenager acting out aggressively, or an employee actively sabotaging projects and spreading cynicism, or citizens taking to the streets to disrupt public infrastructure,
the mainstream instinct is to view them as malicious agents intent on destroying the family, the company, or the society.
But the UED framework says they are rebelling precisely because they are still tethered to the system. They still care.
Wow, they still care.
The teenager still desires connection and validation from their parents. The cynical employee still fundamentally desires fairness, competence, and dignity in their workplace. The disruptive citizen still desires belonging and accountability from their nation.
So beneath the chaotic noise of rebellion sits a profound disappointment and a desperate desire for repair.
They rebel because hope still survives within the structure. They believe the system can still be fixed if they can just make the accumulated delta visible enough to force leadership to act.
It's like they're saying, I am breaking things because I need you to notice that the foundation is cracking and I don't want the house to fall down.
That's a great way to put it.
But because rebellion is loud, messy, and uncomfortable, institutions despise it. Schools expel the rebellious student. Companies fire the dissenting employee. Governments deploy police to clear the protests. We focus entirely on suppressing the event.
And this introduces one of the most dangerous dynamics identified in universal energy dynamics. Suppression creates compression.
Suppression creates compression.
When you suppress a rebellion without resolving the underlying structural delta, the pressure does not dissipate. It is forced inward. It compresses. And the physics of compressed systems dictate that they will eventually behave nonlinearly.
Nonlinearly. Let's use a macroeconomic case study to illustrate this nonlinear compression. The 2008 global financial crisis.
Okay, let's look at that.
If we track the history, the whispers of resistance started years earlier. You had early spikes in subprime mortgage defaults. You had analysts like Michael Burry pointing out massive anomalies in mortgage-backed securities.
With friction.
The market was communicating a threshold.
But the financial institutions ignored the resistance because the metrics, the short-term profits, were incredibly high. So the delta accumulated.
Then the system moved into rebellion. You started seeing mid-level credit markets freezing up slightly. You saw the collapse of Bear Stearns.
The system was shouting that the fundamental architecture of the housing market was structurally unsound.
But the response from the broader system was suppression. They arranged bailouts for specific entities. They provided temporary liquidity. They assured the public that the subprime issue was contained.
They treated the visible event without addressing the massive systemic structural rot of bad debt. They suppressed the rebellion.
By suppressing the rebellion without changing the structure, they compressed the delta to a catastrophic degree. And compressed systems behave nonlinearly.
When the actual threshold of structural tolerance was finally crossed with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the reaction was not proportional to a single bank failing.
The reaction was a massive, nonlinear global economic meltdown. A localized trigger released a globally compressed reaction.
And we see this same nonlinear geometry in our personal lives, too. Let's look at relationship erosion.
Oh, this is such a good example.
One partner starts feeling structurally unsupported. Maybe they're carrying the entire mental load of the household. They mention it quietly. Hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed lately. That's the whisper, the resistance.
And the other partner brushes it off, saying they are just stressed at work. The resistance is ignored.
So the unsupported partner moves to rebellion. They start picking fights, getting sarcastic, withdrawing physical affection. They are screaming for structural support through frustrated restoration.
But the couple focuses entirely on the visible events. They argue about the tone of voice or, who forgot to run the dishwasher.
Right. They suppress the rebellion by treating the symptoms. Stop nagging me. Stop being so dramatic.
The pressure compresses. And then, a year later, someone buys the wrong brand of coffee at the grocery store, and it triggers a volcanic, earth-shattering fight that ends in filing for divorce.
To an outsider, or even to the couple themselves, it looks irrational.
Right. You're ending a 10-year marriage over coffee.
But structurally, the threshold of accumulated delta was finally breached. The tiny trigger released a decade of compressed imbalance.
It perfectly illustrates the boundary line in Chavan's framework. Resistance and rebellion are restoration dynamics. Even during the screaming match over the coffee or the collapse of Bear Stearns, the system is fundamentally asking, can we repair the existing structure?
But when the whisper and the scream repeatedly fail to initiate a meaningful correction, the patience of the system expires. The hope of restoration dies.
The system crosses an invisible, irreversible threshold.
It crosses from restoration dynamics into reconfiguration dynamics. The system ceases to ask, can we repair this? And begins to dictate, something fundamental must now change.
The realization solidifies that the current architecture, the current distribution of labor in the marriage, the current regulatory environment of the financial sector, the current operating system of Nokia can physically no longer contain the reality of the pressure.
Simple repair is obsolete. The geometry itself must be rewritten.
This plunges us into the deep end of the framework, reconfiguration dynamics. This is where we encounter reform and revolution. Let's explore R3 reform. Chavan refers to this as intelligent reconfiguration.
Reform is the hallmark of a highly mature, highly intelligent system. It is the intentional, controlled redesign of a structure to preserve its ultimate continuity.
So the system recognizes that the old way of operating is dead, but instead of allowing a catastrophic collapse, it actively reorganizes its own core parameters.
Yes, constitutions are amended, corporate business models are entirely pivoted, deep-seated psychological traumas are processed and integrated.
It is the most efficient form of profound change, because you are redesigning the airplane while it is still flying, rather than letting it crash and trying to build a new one from the wreckage.
It requires a massive expenditure of intellectual and emotional energy, but it is vastly cheaper than revolution. However, the critical caveat in Chavan's work is that not all change is reform.
Right. He introduces the coherence-based redesign framework.
Exactly.
How does that framework actually operate? Because, we see companies reorganize all the time and nothing actually improves.
To understand the mechanics of coherence-based redesign, we have to differentiate between load-bearing structures and cosmetic features.
Load-bearing versus cosmetic.
Many organizations attempt to reform by altering the cosmetics. They might roll out a new mission statement, implement a casual Friday policy, or buy new software.
But if the load-bearing structure, for instance, a compensation model that financially rewards interdepartmental sabotage over collaboration remains untouched, the delta continues to accumulate.
That is not reform. That is just rearranging the furniture on a sinking ship.
So true reform requires an architectural audit.
It requires asking ruthless structural questions. What specific pressure caused the initial resistance? What foundational threshold failed? And what structural redesign will actually restore long-term sustainability?
If a couple goes to therapy, true reform isn't just learning I statements.
No, true reform is fundamentally renegotiating the power dynamics and emotional responsibilities of the partnership. It is altering the geometry of the relationship to make it sustainable.
But wait, let me push back on the viability of reform here. What if the people in charge of the system benefit directly from the accumulated delta?
That's a very real scenario.
Right. What if the corporate board is getting rich off the toxic culture, or a dictator is maintaining power through the societal instability? Reform requires the system to willingly dismantle its own flawed architecture. What if the system absolutely refuses to reform?
If the system refuses to reform, if the leadership is too rigid or the individual is too terrified of change, the delta does not stop accumulating. The pressure continues to build until the system is forced into R4 revolution.
And this is where the framework gets incredibly dark, but also incredibly clarifying. Because historically, culturally, we romanticize revolution.
We do.
We write soaring anthems about it. We put it in blockbuster movies. We view it as a glorious triumph of the human spirit. But Chavan strips all the romance away. He says revolution is structurally nothing more than delayed reform.
Delayed reform. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is forced reconfiguration. When resistance is ignored, rebellion is suppressed, and reform is actively blocked, the accumulated pressure inevitably exceeds the maximum containment capacity of the system.
The old structure shatters because it physically, economically, or socially can no longer hold the unresolved delta. Hi, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's move away from the standard analogies here. Revolution isn't just a pressure cooker blowing its lid. Let's look at it like tectonic fault lines.
Okay, I like that.
For decades, the tectonic plates are grinding against each other deep underground. That is the resistance. Occasionally, you get microquakes, small tremors that release a bit of tension.
The whisper.
If the system is reforming, it allows these microquakes to safely redistribute the energy. But if the fault line gets locked, if the system refuses to move, the pressure compresses for decades. The revolution is the 9.0 earthquake. It happens in 30 seconds, but it is the violent, delayed manifestation of 30 years of suppressed movement. It levels the entire city.
The tectonic plate metaphor is exceptionally accurate because it highlights the defining characteristic of revolution, which is catastrophic cost.
Catastrophic cost.
Revolution is not an achievement. It is a failure of early adaptation. The cost of releasing the pressure through a 9.0 earthquake is the destruction of the existing infrastructure. And we see this play out across every conceivable domain of human experience.
Let's look at the history of science, specifically a scientific paradigm shift, which is a form of profound intellectual revolution.
Like the transition from classical Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics.
Precisely. At the end of the 19th century, classical physics was the absolute, unquestioned architecture of scientific reality.
It was the foundation.
But then, researchers started noticing anomalies, like the ultraviolet catastrophe and black body radiation. The math wasn't working.
That was the whisper, the resistance. The data was communicating a structural failure in the Newtonian model.
But the scientific establishment initially suppressed it. They tried to force the new data to fit the old math.
They suppressed the rebellion of the data. Max Planck eventually introduced the concept of quantized energy, quanta, essentially, as a mathematical trick.
He was trying to execute a minor reform just to make the equations work, while still preserving the classical structure.
But the delta was too massive. The reality of the quantum world could not be contained within Newtonian geometry. Albert Einstein and others took Planck's work, and the accumulated pressure shattered the classical paradigm.
It was a scientific revolution.
The old structure was violently overthrown, and physics had to completely rebuild its understanding of reality from the ground up.
And Chavan points out that this exact same violent reconfiguration happens internally to individuals. We call it an identity crisis or a nervous breakdown, but structurally it is an internal revolution.
Exactly.
You spend 15 years in a career that fundamentally violates your core values. Your body resists with chronic fatigue. Your emotions rebel with panic attacks.
And you refuse to reform your life. You keep taking on more projects. You lock the tectonic plates.
And then one Tuesday, your nervous system simply initiates a 9.0 earthquake. You can't get out of bed. Your entire identity shatters. The you that existed can no longer contain the reality of your life. It is survival through forced catastrophic reconfiguration.
Revolution clears the pressure, yes. But wise systems understand that the longer you delay intelligent correction, the more expensive the eventual resolution becomes.
Revolution means the old structure is completely eradicated. The long-term marriage is over, the historical empire has collapsed, the scientific model is obsolete.
You now have to rebuild civilization, or your life, entirely from the ashes.
So the earthquake happens, the city falls, the old paradigm shatters, and then we rebuild, the dust settles, and we finally reach a state of perfect, permanent peace.
Right.
That is the ultimate illusion.
And this brings us to the most profound and perhaps the most challenging part of Chavan's entire philosophy, the hidden fifth R resolution.
The layer of reality that almost no one talks about.
Because we are so deeply conditioned by narrative arcs, by movies, by fairy tales, by political campaigns, to expect a clean binary ending. We assume that you have a problem, you enact a solution, and the problem is deleted from reality.
Universal energy dynamics explicitly dismantles this binary view. The core structural truth of the fifth R is this: nothing resolves perfectly. Everything settles operationally.
Everything settles operationally. Let's dig deep into the mechanics of that. Let's talk about the concept of residue.
Residue is arguably the most uniquely vital concept in the game of Rs. Every resolution, whether it is achieved through the careful intelligence of reform or the violent destruction of revolution, leaves traces behind.
It leaves architectural residue. It is not unresolved chaos. It is simply the material reality of what remains after a system settles into a new equilibrium.
It's like a physical scar after a severe laceration heals. The biological system successfully resolved the crisis. You didn't bleed out. But the collagen fibers in the scar tissue are aligned differently than normal skin.
The tissue is forever changed.
It might be tighter, it might be less sensitive, but the scar is the resolution.
We see this organizational and cultural residue everywhere. Let's return to the couple who successfully went through therapy during the reform stage. They did the hard work. They fundamentally shifted their communication geometry.
But there is still residue.
Perhaps a specific tone of voice or a particular phrasing still triggers a momentary silent flinch in one partner. An emotional reflex remains encoded in their nervous system.
Or consider a society recovering from a massive political revolution. The old authoritarian regime is gone, a new democratic constitution is operating, but a deep cultural instinct of suspicion toward authority remains embedded in the population for generations.
The residue of instability lingers long after the event has passed.
The danger, as Chavan so brilliantly points out, is that we constantly mistake resolution for erasure.
We think, if we fix the communication issue, why do I still feel a spike of anxiety when we argue? If we overthrew the dictator, why is our society still struggling with trust?
And because we still feel the scar tissue, we panic. We assume the healing failed. We assume the system is still broken.
Mistaking resolution for erasure generates an immense amount of unnecessary human suffering. We expect the slate of reality to be wiped completely clean.
But living systems, ecological systems, social systems, they do not possess a delete button.
They function through continuous historical negotiation. The residue is not a symptom of failure. The residue is the architectural proof that the system survived, adapted, and integrated the pressure.
That ties directly into the physics of what Chavan calls dissipation pathways. Because when that 9.0 earthquake happens, or even when you safely release the microquakes, the kinetic energy doesn't just vanish into the ether.
The first law of thermodynamics tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. In UED, pressure does not magically disappear. It redistributes.
Dissipation is the gradual, systematic release or reorganization of unresolved energy over time.
And this is perhaps where modern hyper-optimized society fails most profoundly. We continually accelerate the accumulation of pressure-demanding, constant productivity, constant digital stimulation, constant systemic growth, but we systematically deny our systems the time, space, and biological resources for dissipation.
We treat recovery as an inefficiency. We expect a global supply chain to go through a massive chaotic restructuring on Friday and be operating at 110% optimization on Monday morning.
We expect a human being to go through a devastating divorce or a brutal corporate layoff and be back out there functioning perfectly a month later.
We view recovery as a luxury or a weakness.
But in the architecture of systems, recovery is intelligence. It is the active process of a system restoring sustainable coherence after a major reconfiguration. The elite athlete must rest after severe training so the muscle fibers can physically rebuild stronger.
The grieving mind must slow its cognitive processing to integrate the reality of a profound loss.
The organizational culture requires a period of stability to trust the new leadership structure. If you rush the dissipation phase, if you force the system back into high-pressure performance before the residue has settled and the geometry has stabilized, you recreate the exact conditions for suffering.
You invite the delta to begin accumulating all over again, often faster than before. I have to jump in here and voice a concern that might be creeping up for anyone tracking this deeply.
Sure. What is it?
If every resolution leaves permanent residue, and the pressure just continually redistributes and nothing is ever permanently, flawlessly solved, isn't that inherently depressing?
It can sound that way, yes.
Doesn't that imply we're just trapped on an endless, exhausting treadmill of resistance, rebellion, and reform? We are never just done.
It is a very natural philosophical reaction to feel overwhelmed by that. We are deeply seduced by the promise of permanence, the marketing illusion that if we just acquire the perfect job, marry the perfect partner, or engineer the perfect political system, we will achieve a static state of permanent peace and stop having to adapt.
But Chavan reframes this lack of permanence beautifully.
He does. The fact that nothing is ever permanently solved is not depressing. It is the source of all vitality.
How does that become vital?
Because it liberates you from the impossible burden of static perfection. It means you can stop panicking every time life renegotiates itself. Life is not a static puzzle to be solved and put on a shelf. It's a dynamic process to be continuously resolved.
He uses the concept of sustainable equilibrium, right?
Yes. To understand this, think about the biomechanics of walking. Walking is essentially a series of controlled falls. You intentionally lose your balance, you step forward into the instability, you catch yourself, and you establish a new temporary balance.
That is sustainable equilibrium. It is continuous movement, not frozen perfection.
So when a difficult emotion resurfaces, or a new point of friction appears in a team at work, it isn't a sign that you are fundamentally broken or that your previous efforts failed.
It is simply reality doing exactly what reality does. It is the system adjusting to a new flow of pressure.
That removes an incredible amount of shame and anxiety. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to maintain your capacity to adjust.
You shift your psychological baseline from demanding permanent certainty from life to developing what Chavan calls resolution intelligence.
It is the practical applied wisdom of living inside a perpetually unfinished reality without constantly feeling victimized or broken by it.
So what does this all mean? How do we operationalize this? How do you, listening to this, actually become an intelligent resolver? How do you take this grand, sweeping, structural theory of civilizations and tectonic plates and apply it to your project management meeting on Tuesday morning or your argument with your spouse tonight?
The core metric of an intelligent resolver is their resolution rate. In UED, the resolution rate is defined as the speed and the accuracy with which a system detects pressure, adapts its architecture to it, and restores internal coherence.
A high resolution rate is the ultimate indicator of systemic maturity.
It's about matching your time to adapt to your time to detect.
Exactly that. The great tragedy of human systems, as Chavan observes, is that we almost always possess the data long before we take action.
Oh, absolutely. The biological system knew it was chronically fatigued long before the adrenal burnout. The partner knew the emotional intimacy was drifting long before the infidelity or the divorce.
The society knew the economic inequalities were unsustainable long before the populist uprisings. The signals were present. The whisper was echoing through the system.
But we delayed the adaptation.
We wait for the 9.0 earthquake. We wait until the acute pain of staying exactly the same finally overrides the terrifying uncertainty of changing.
An intelligent resolver stops waiting for the earthquake. They actively intervene at the whisper stage. They train themselves to listen to the resistance without judgment.
If you are a leader and you detect subtle, persistent friction in your department, you do not pathologize the employees or wait for them to quit or actively rebel.
You initiate an architectural audit. You sit down and ask, what specific structural pressure is causing this friction? How can we reform this workflow right now?
You address the delta while it is still localized, minor, and cheap to resolve.
And to execute that successfully, you have to prioritize something that is incredibly difficult for human beings. You have to prioritize coherence over ego.
This is perhaps the most challenging psychological shift for both individuals and leaders. The human ego is obsessed with the illusion of the event and the culture of blame.
The ego constantly asks, who is right in this situation? The ego desires to win the argument. The ego desires to force reality to bend to its pre-existing assumptions.
But coherence asks a completely different, profoundly structural question. What protects the continuity of this system?
What protects continuity? If you internalize nothing else from this deep dive, internalize that question.
An intelligent resolver understands that aggressively winning an argument might permanently fracture the foundation of the relationship. Forcing an unpopular policy through without addressing the resistance might permanently destroy the team's trust.
They are willing to reform, to negotiate, to creatively redesign the geometry of the situation, because their ultimate objective is not the temporary high of being right, but ensuring the system survives, adapts, and remains healthy.
They consciously choose the minor, controlled discomfort of reform over the catastrophic, uncontrolled cost of revolution.
Stop waiting for the revolution. Address the burnout in your career when it's just a whisper of Sunday night anxiety. Address the distance in your relationships when it's just a whisper of distraction.
Address your own internal misalignment before your biology forces you to collapse.
The ultimate realization of the game of ours is that the strongest, most resilient systems in the world are not the ones that exist without pressure. A system without pressure is dead.
The strongest systems are simply the ones wise enough to listen and adapt, while reality is still only whispering.
Let's zoom out and look at the entire 5R framework one last time. Resistance, rebellion, reform, revolution, resolution.
It is a lens that fundamentally alters how you perceive the world. It allows you to look at the chaos in your own personal life, or the dizzying geopolitical chaos on the evening news, and stop seeing random, terrifying destruction.
Instead, you start seeing the hidden geometry. You see structural intelligence desperately trying to find balance. You see systems navigating accumulated delta.
You see the game of ours playing out step by step in real time.
And once you can clearly see that geometry, you can stop fighting the chaos. You can begin navigating the resolution. You can participate in the continuous operational settling of reality with a great deal more grace and significantly less panic.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to carry with you. We spent a lot of time unpacking that fifth R, resolution, and the concept of residue.
The structural reality that every resolution leaves traces behind, that nothing is ever perfectly cleanly erased.
We usually view our personal residue in a negative light. We see it as our emotional scars, our historical traumas, the psychological baggage we're forced to drag around.
But let's flip that perspective entirely.
If every resolution leaves architectural residue and nothing is ever truly erased, what if the very personality you identify as you right now is entirely constructed from the invisible residue of your past resolutions?
Wow. Think about the geometry of your own mind. Your current boundaries, your specific sense of humor, your work ethic, the precise things you love fiercely, the specific things you fear.
They aren't just random inherent traits. They are the settled architecture left behind by every single time you resisted, every time you rebelled, every time you intelligently reformed, and every time you survived a catastrophic revolution in your own life.
You aren't just a passive player observing the game of ours.
You are the living, breathing architecture left behind. Think about that the next time you feel a whisper. Until next time.